Okay, hi everyone. I just want to do a quick overview of one of the major concepts in ecology, something called community ecology. This is going to be one piece of multiple videos that we'll produce, talk about different aspects of ecology. This will be the first one we're going to talk about. It's relevant to what we're going to be doing coming up when we talk about Yellowstone National Park and what's going on there next week. So I just want to go through some definitions and kind of give you an overview of what this actually means. We'll talk about energy flow and how energy flows through ecological systems later on. We talk about plants. I think we'll emphasize that. So anyways, let's start with community ecology. So basically a community is kind of like what you would expect a community to be with humans, human community, right? It's all the people that live in a particular area and interact with each other in that area, right? So that would be the same in ecology, essentially, except that we'd be talking about all the different organisms that inhabit a particular area, right? So all species, and that would include plants and animals and every other type of organism that would be in the area, right? So it'd be some sort of defined area that we'd be talking about, and we'd be really concerned about the organisms that live close enough to interact with each other, right? And so there's a whole branch of ecology, which is actually studying that, right? How these interactions happen between organisms and how they actually determine community structure as a result of that. Very similar to like doing sociology or something like that, where you're studying how humans interact and form structures in human communities. Okay, so if you think about community structures and what communities are doing, you could probably come up with some major interactions that would be pretty important, right? And we can actually sort of quantify, not formally in this case, but kind of informally quantify these interactions, like how they impact different organisms in a group. And if you think about like what kind of interactions there might be, well, if organisms are competing for food, for example, there'd be competition, right? So one group of organisms would be dealing with trying to get a food source. Another group of organisms would be doing the same thing, right? And they're in the same area, so they're interacting. So there'd be competition, right? You could also have predation, where one organism is eating another, right? And that would include parasitism and disease, which are both forms of predation, right? And there's this thing called mutualism, where organisms interact in such a way that it's beneficial to both, right? So they cooperate in some way. And there's commensalism, which is an interaction that's good for one organism and not so good, or not bad necessarily, but kind of neutral for another organism, right? So here's how we quantify these. So competition would be negative, right? If you're competing with someone else or something, it's basically negative for you and negative for the other person until one of you wins, or one of you beats out the other one, or the other one dies, right? So competition tends to be negative, right? It's detrimental to both species, right? So if we're talking about the species level, the numbers of individuals in the community of that species will be kept low as a result of competition because of lack of access to resources, right? Predation is another interaction which is positive for one organism, right? The organism that's actually eating the other organism, it's good for them, right? They get to get calories from that and energy supply, and the other one dies, right? So that's bad, negative, right? So very detrimental to the organism that's predated on, but very good for the organism that's doing the predating, right? Mutualism, on the other hand, is good for both, right? Interaction between both species that ends up being very, very helpful. And actually, there's many, many examples of this, but one that's very common is a bee, right? All types of different types of bees. Bees have mutualistic relationships with plants that actually have flowers, right? Plants produce flowers that give the bees some sort of sustenance, food, nectar, pollen, for example, and the bees function to the benefit of the flowers by transporting pollen from plant to plant and helping plants reproduce. Okay, so that's good for both organisms. And actually, organisms put a lot of resources into making this mutualistic relationship work. This is not just the only example, many, many examples of this. Commensalism is a little hard to find, but you see it sometimes. And this is one organism benefits, and the other one, it doesn't really matter, right? And there's a few examples of that. We'll hit on these, right? But these different types of interactions determine kind of these interaction organisms in the community, right? If you have competition going on, you have organisms actually directly trying to get resources away from the other organism, right? Predation results in all sorts of cool things, right? Because predation means that one organism eats the other, well, the other organism doesn't want to get eaten, so it actually involves all sorts of responses to that, right? Camouflage and ability to run fast, and whatever it might be, right? So this results in some kind of interesting evolutionary relationships. This is, of course, a very interesting evolutionary relationships too, right? But in a different nature. Okay, so let's talk about competition real quick. Interspecific competition is competition for common resource pools by organisms of different species. That makes some sense, right? And so we come to this concept called the niche, which we need to sort of define. A niche is all the resources, biotic, which would be life-based, right? Living types of resources, including biological molecules, and abiotic, right? So abiotic would be shelter, access to water, whatever, stuff like that, right? That species uses from its environment. Ignore that apostrophe, right? And this results in some kind of interesting kind of things that happen. So ecologists have defined this thing called the competitive exclusion principle, which is any two species that use an identical, underline that, ecological niche cannot coexist in the same area. They will compete over short periods of time until one goes extinct, or it evolves to use different resources. It's called resource partitioning. So you don't find in ecological systems two different species of organisms that are using exactly the same resources simultaneously. There's only one, right? And there's other ones that use maybe similar resources or very similar or closely related, but they're actually in a different niche, right? I'll show you an example of that in a second. If there are significant differences between the niches of two similar species, they can coexist, makes sense, right? And there's an evolutionary pressure here, right? So if two organisms are competing for the same resources, there is a pressure for them to diverge and become different species, right? This helps cause speciation, like we talked about last term. It's called character displacement. Like these characteristics of the two similar species will tend to diverge in sympatric population, which means that these are populations that all exist in the same area, right? They're not geographically isolated. They will tend to separate and evolve into different lines, right? That will be slightly different from each other because there'll be different leg length, wing shape, or something that's making them a little bit different and be able to access resources that'll be a little bit different from the other species, right? And this would encourage resource partitioning, right? Okay, so the competitive exclusion principle, here's one that's actually been experimentally shown, right? There is this thing called the fundamental niche, which is the entire range an organism can utilize. So for example, this barnacle here, thalamus, can actually access a resource that goes from extreme high tide to low tide, right? And they can access this whole thing. But they're in competition with another species of barnacle called Balanus. And this one has its fundamental niche is a little bit lower, it's smaller. It doesn't go all the way up to high tide line, but it goes a little bit lower and all the way down low tide. Now, if you put Thamylus by itself on rocks, it will grow through this whole range, right? And that'd be an indication of its fundamental niche, right? And of course, if you Balanus on its own on a rock, it'll grow through this range, through this area, right? If you put them both together now in competition, the Balanus will exclude by competitive exclusion the Thamylus species, and these guys will be left only able to use resources in the niche in which they're not in competition directly with Balanus, because Balanus cannot actually colonize this area, it's too high, right? So Balanus only is down here and the Thamylus is up here. Well, they can coexist only because Balanus is localized down here and cannot reach up this high, right? So these are called realized niches. This for the Thamylus, its realized niche is up here where it's not in competition with Balanus, right? And the Balanus realized niche is essentially the same as its fundamental niche because it outcompetes the Thamylus when it's in direct competition, right? And those are called realized niches. This is where what you actually see when they're in competition with each other in a natural environment. Okay, resource partitioning is another thing. We see this. There's this really interesting paper, Adaptive Radiation Island Lizards, about Caribbean lizards that all are descended from a common ancestor. and all the different Caribbean islands. And these lizards all basically from one species, right? And they've been distributed on different islands through some way, hurricanes or something. Somehow they've gotten from island to island. And then when they get the island, they all, one species would spread, right? And become common on different parts of the island. And then they would start competing with each other and result in the species actually doing resource partitioning. So lizards would evolve differences in characteristics so they could access different niches. So these different niches would be accessing the crown of the forest, for example, way up here in the upper parts of the trees, or accessing different parts of the trunks and using eating insects in those areas, or living on twigs that come off the branch, and a bunch live on the ground, right? So these lizards become different, look different, right? They have different characteristics, different tail length, different leg length, maybe different body shape, head shape, whatever, but they're all derived from the same original species, and they become different species by evolutionary principles that we talked about last term, right? And it is because resource partitioning is happening that actually is happening. So this is character displacement. The characteristics of the organisms are changing. So character displacement, and then they're accessing resources in different ways. That's resource partitioning. Now these lizards are not all competing for the same niche. All these are different niches, and they can access those in peace, more or less, right? And we know by DNA and genetic evidence that these lizards are very closely related. So this happens very quickly in certain resources. You can see character displacement happen in beak depth and Galapagos finches. The Grants, Rosemary, and what's his name? Anyways, the Grants studied Galapagos finches in Galapagos, and they found that there are species of finch, when living on their own, have their own kind of fundamental niche, right? Here's G. fortis, which has this range of beak sizes. And here's Fuliginosa, which has this range of beak size when it's living on its own island. So Los Hermanos Island, where only the Fuliginosa lives, right, has this range of beak depths, right? Fortis has this range of beak depths when it lives on Daphne by itself, but you put them both on the same island, naturally, this is a natural system, right? They have separated. So sympatric populations living in the same space, right? Now they undergo character displacement and probably resource partitioning too, right? So Fuliginosa has a smaller beak depth. The Fortis has a larger beak depth, and that's kind of a subset almost of the beak sizes that are found in the populations by themselves, right? A little bit of evolution probably suggesting that the Fortis is actually going toward bigger beak size, right? And Fuliginosa is going to smaller beak size here, right? But basically they're subsets of these when they're by themselves, okay? So that's another example of this happening. All right, now, what about a relationship between an organism and its, and another way is predation. Well, predation is one organism eating another. Herbivory, of course, is a form of predation in a sense, right? It's an animal that eats a plant. The plant's being predated on, and the animal's eating the plant's herbivore. There's parasitism, right? A parasite lives on a host organism, depends on that host for nutrition, and actually stays with that organism all the time, right? That's a form of predation, even though it's kill the host, right? Okay, now this results in all sorts of cool things, right? Because the predated animal, the prey organism, needs defenses against the predator, right? Now, common defenses are well, we'll get into that in a second, but the predators actually have to co-evolve also. They have to find a way to get around the defenses of the prey, right? So predators, we know all these things, right? They have claws. Lions have claws, right? They have keen senses, ability to detect prey easily, right? They have teeth, they have fangs, they have nasty beaks, they have talons for raptors, they have poisons, stingers, all these things, right, to help catch their prey, right? Now, plants do this too, right? Plants will evolve ways of avoiding predation, right? So there's plant defenses against herbivores. Of course, you find these all the time, like thorns, right? Common defense. These are nasty. They poke into the animal that's trying to eat the plant, and the plant animal doesn't want to eat the plant when these thorns are around, right? Toxins, eat a plant and it kills you. Well, that's a pretty good defense, right? etc. Okay. And then of course animals evolve defense against predators. So the prey animals, they can fly, they can run fast, right? Antelope, for example, with cheetahs, they have flight, they can fly away. Active defenses, poisons, different things. They might squirt at an animal that's coming at them, right? Skunks, for example, squirt an offensive chemical that smells bad, that kind of thing, right? They can camouflage, right? They become hard to see, makes prey hard to see. Well, of course, prey's defense against that is to evolve keen senses, right? And the camouflage gets better as the keen senses get better, right? So there's an arms race going on here. Mechanical defenses, porcupine quill is a good example of that. Chemical defenses, which you mentioned as part of an active defense here, smells, poisons, and animals that do this tend to actually be brightly colored. They advertise that they are nasty, right? So you often know an animal is going to be a nasty, if you attack it, you're going to get a nice surprise. It's going to be unpleasant because of these different defenses. They usually advertise. This is called aposematic coloration. It's kind of a cool thing, right? A great example is a wasp or a wasp, like a yellow and black coloration, banding coloration, right? Clear indication that there's a sting involved when you eat that animal, right? So yeah, don't do that, right? Of course, other organisms can actually use that kind of coloration as a way of defending themselves passively, right? So this is called partition mimicry, where you actually resemble another species to provide passive defense, right? So if you look like a bee, but you're not a bee, that's a good defense, right? And then there's another form of that happens in evolutionary, which is called Mullerian mimicry, which is kind of cool too, right? If you are a bee or a wasp and you have yellow and black coloration, it's useful if you are also a wasp of a different species to actually evolve that same kind of defense coloration, because the predators will actually recognize that same defense and leave you alone too, right? So it's kind of a collective defense. So all bees and wasps are kind of the same, right? They all have banded color patterns, yellow and black often, or orange and black. And it's kind of obvious. You see a bee, you think it's a wasp. With a wasp, it looks like a bee, right? Okay, so here's camouflage, right? We all know about that. Here's aposematic colorations. The poison dart frog has nasty toxin in it. And if you eat this thing, it's going to kill you, right? So this is pretty clear. Don't eat that, right? Very bright blue, right? Here's partition mimicry, right? Here's a caterpillar, yummy caterpillar, delicious, but it's evolved a way to defend itself by having a defense that looks like a snake, right? So a bird comes along this and sees this part of the caterpillar and goes, whoa, that looks like a head of a snake, and it stays away, right? Because the snake might eat it. Well, no, the caterpillar is completely helpless, right, and harmless. But this is a pretty good defense. It scares the birds away frequently enough to give it a good defense, right? Here's Mullerian mimicry, right? Two different types of wasps look very similar. Okay, parasites and pathogens are also predators. Endoparasites are the ones that live inside the body of a host, and those malaria, tapeworm, viruses, types of bacterial pathogens. And ectoparasites, the ones that feed on the outside of the host, like mosquitoes, for example, or ticks, that kind of thing. All right, mutualism. We've mentioned this. Mutual symbiosis, interspecific interaction that benefits both species, flowers and pollinators, nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the roots of legumes, cellulose digesting bacteria in termite guts, right? A lot of examples of these. Acacia trees in Africa have ants that live on them. The tree feeds the ants defend the tree, right? So here's an acacia tree, here's an ant defended area around the tree. You can see it's been cleared of vegetation and stuff. Animal comes along to eat the acacia tree and the ants swarm it, bite it, make it unpleasant. And so the animal goes, oh, never mind, and leaves, right? Mutualistic defense. All right, commensalism, only one species benefits. I don't think I have any examples. Okay, all right, no. Okay, now we should talk about trophic. Actually, I'm going to stop here. So this is community structures, part one, community ecology, part one. All right, and we will do part two next.